The DJI FPV is easily the most fun I've ever had with a drone, but it's also the drone I've crashed most often relative to the number of times I've taken it into the air. Now the dust and debris has settled, what have we learnt about the DJI FPV? One of the reasons I was so enthusiastic flying this drone for the first time was because it was my first FPV experience. I'd never flown FPV before, so if you're a beginner at FPV like me, yes, you will find this drone absolutely fantastic. If you're a super advanced racing FPV enthusiast, then no, it's probably not for you. It's very clear from the marketing materials and from the functionality of the drone that it's a bit of a one-size-fits-all experience for beginners through to somewhat advanced FPV pilots. So we have to keep in mind who this drone is targeted at, and you need to weigh that up against your own experience and expectations if you're considering purchasing it. In terms of the performance and handling of this drone, well, your opinion will depend on your own reference points within the FPV world. I personally have no reference points other than the Mavics and Phantoms, so for me this thing is absolutely terrifying. The speed that it goes at, the noise that it makes, it's absolutely exhilarating, but in part because you're absolutely terrified while flying it. I personally can't imagine getting to the point where I'm looking for more power and more maneuverability, but much more advanced pilots have made those observations. I would propose that for 90% of people buying this drone, it will more than exceed their requirements for the very long foreseeable future when it comes to performance and handling. One criticism I have of this entire system is that you need the goggles to fly the drone. I would love to be able to fly it like a normal Mavic, just using my phone to monitor this camera, but also having the option of just looking up to see where the drone is at any point in time. If I want to switch into full immersive FPV goggle mode, then I can, but I don't have to. That would solve a lot of these kind of dangerous issues for me, to be honest with you, because you're looking at things through a very wide angle lens, which is an unnatural field of view. You don't have great perception of where things are when you're looking through the goggles, and that increases the hazardous nature of things. Added to that, you can't really see around you. You can't just switch your head from side to side. You're looking straight down the barrel of the camera that's on the pointy end of that drone. It definitely increases the risks, which is why you have to have a spotter with you, which is why visual line of sight flying is not possible, and therefore you just got a whole bunch of headaches with the FPV system, and it is for me quite a barrier to taking it out sometimes. Now, DJI does let you monitor the flight, so you can plug in your phone to your goggles and you can monitor on the DJI FPV app, but you can't change any camera settings, you can't do anything like that. All you can do is monitor it, and you can update your firmware that way. That's it, to be honest with you, and I think that's very restrictive and unnecessarily so. Added to that, if you did want to go down that route, for example, you've got nowhere to put your phone, you can't just put it on your controller there, which is one thing. You've got these goggles that you've got to kind of hang over your arm, you've got a battery dangling down on a cable, you've got this coming out. The whole thing is just a bit ridiculous and a bit annoying, so it's clearly an obstruction to you doing that, and a deliberate one, to be honest with you. So personally, I think that would solve a lot of problems if we could fly this drone with its rocky, swaying, super fun FPV style of flight, but just like a normal Mavic, and then if opportunity permits, you can put the goggles on if you have a spotter or if you're in an environment where it's safe to do so. A super useful failsafe that FPV drone enthusiasts will appreciate is the return to home functionality if you lose a signal between your controller and your drone. Now, we're used to that on the Mavic drones, and it's not something I've ever really had to rely on because the OcuSync 2.0, 3.0, whichever system it is virtually indestructible for my needs. You fly it a kilometre away, it's no problem whatsoever. The observation I have with this system, however, is that I was having a lot of problems with signal strength between the controller and the drone with the OcuSync 3.0. Now, in theory, you get a stated range of 10 kilometers, whatever it is, but it was constantly cutting out on me and initiating return to home in the middle of some fantastic maneuver that I had set up, and it was super frustrating. And I think the reason for that is I'm flying this a lot closer to the ground. I'm taking advantage of this kind of mountainous environment to try and get some kind of sense of movement. But even if I could see that thing, if there was a bit of rock formation in the way or anything, it would initiate return to home, and that was a bit of a shock for me. The big question here is, do you trust yourself with it? And I personally have proven to be very untrustworthy with the DJI FPV. It kind of turns me into a bit of a idiot, it has to be said, behind the sticks, because the experience is so immersive with the goggles on. You get so carried away, you think you're flying in a computer game, and you just do stupid things and you take risks. Now, I can only speak for myself. Possibly my risk appetite is higher than it should be because we didn't pay for these drones. DJI sent them to us, but nonetheless, you get a little bit into it. So you need to ask yourself, can you be trusted with this power at your fingertips? With all that being said, durability comes sharply into focus, and I managed to smash one of these on a tree. This is the second drone that we've got, and I managed to stick it in a tree as well. As per my previous point, you just get a bit carried away. I don't have any reference point with traditional FPV, but I think it's fair to say that traditional FPV is a little bit more forgiving with those lightweight carbon fiber frames and so on and so forth. So this thing definitely is a little bit more brittle. You need to take care. The picture quality of this camera took us by surprise because it's not very good, if I'm honest with you. Forget about any notion of protecting your highlights when you're filming and then recovering your shadows and midtones in post. There's just no detail there to play with whatsoever. Even if you expose correctly, you have grainy shadows and midtones. Now, I think this is quite surprising because DJI must have known that they're going to be compared against a GoPro, for example, with this system, or even against their own products like the original Mavic Mini or the Mini 2. This does not come up favorably. Stabilization is not provided by way of a mechanical gimbal, but by way of electronic image stabilization, which is a digital realignment of the various frames, thanks to the gyro data that is provided by a little sensor that sits within the drone. Now, the EIS, electronic image stabilization, that takes place in here is pretty good, and we've been able to get some nice, smooth, pretty cinematic results. Kind of similar to what you would get with Hypersmooth on a GoPro, although arguably GoPro still has the edge when it comes to in-camera electronic image stabilization. GoPro-based FPV enthusiasts can take their stabilization to the next level with a piece of software called RealSteady. Now, essentially, the process is exactly the same. It's electronic image stabilization, but instead of taking place inside the body of the camera, it takes place in post-production. It's taking exactly the same gyro data that comes from a little sensor that sits inside these devices, and it's taking exactly the same footage, but it gives you manual control over the level of crop and therefore the level of stabilization that you're able to achieve. And this is how we see these incredible 90-second FPV clips of these drones going down mountain ridges and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely superb. And the electronic image stabilization that takes place in body is going to struggle to compete with that. I think it would be interesting to see if DJI can give us that option in future. It's not a completely out there concept. The new Sony a7S III has in-camera stabilization and optical stabilization of the sensor, but it also gives you the option to switch all of that off, take the files and the raw gyro data into their own piece of software called Catalyst Browse, this being the equivalent of RealSteady, and then doing a post-production process of electronic image stabilization on the Sony's footage. So it's not a completely bizarre concept that DJI would give us that option should we wish. We could have it done in camera if we want to, or we could take it into their own software as yet undeveloped if we want to for those more advanced longer runs. At the moment, however, that option doesn't exist, so that might be important in your decision-making process, or like some, you might just choose to bolt your GoPro to the top of the DJI FPV itself. What happened to the cinematic frame rates? At the moment, the lowest frame rate we can get is 50 frames per second. In the US, you might use 60 frames per second. But apparently, according to DJI, 24, 25 and 30 frames per second were on their way. I'll be curious to see if they come because I would like to see them. I wonder if it's a technical issue. I would speculate the electronic image stabilization is not very helpful in this respect because EIS does not work well when there's motion blur in a shot. You're kind of needing these crispy frames that don't have any motion blur so they can all be digitally realigned. And if you're shooting at 25 frames per second with a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, there's going to be tons of motion blur. That could have a role to play. Alternatively, the fact that we only have one camera here, the actual video camera is the same as the video transmission camera. That could have some kind of technical barrier to us achieving those lower frame rates. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, they are not with us yet. You probably don't have to ever fly this thing in full manual mode to enjoy the DJI FPV. I don't really have the skills to fly this in manual mode, to be honest with you. I've tried in the simulator, it's not intuitive, and I didn't have the time to master it and to try and fly it. But I've still got some pretty great, somewhat cinematic results with sports mode. With that in mind, I wouldn't pretend to be the guy that could teach you how to fly great FPV, but based on some experience from normal camera drone side of things, I do have a few observations. One of which is aimlessly flying this thing around is not going to result in very pleasing footage. You definitely want to pick 1 or 2 maneuvers per battery to kind of practice over and over again, get your confidence up, maybe get a little bit closer to that tree or that cliff face every single time to get things a little bit more exciting, and then come away from each battery with maybe just 1 great shot instead of 12 or 15 minutes of aimless, pointless footage. The other thing I've noticed is that much like normal drone flying, it's quite easy to get into some kind of maneuver, but it's much harder to smoothly get out of it, revealing your subject and giving that shot purpose. Just physically, the mechanics of easing out of a maneuver can be quite hard. You tend to jolt out of that maneuver. Doing it smoothly is difficult, but if you want some kind of reason for those shots, or some kind of reason for someone to want to watch those shots, you kind of have to do that big loop-de-loop and then settle on your subject. And I think that takes a little bit of planning, a little bit of strategy, and it certainly takes some practice on those sticks to ease out of those maneuvers. We did a collaboration with Matt Potchwat to try and figure out whether or not what's sitting on the table here represents good value at $1,299. Now, as it turns out, for a digital FPV system with this kind of functionality, it actually is quite good value. But that doesn't change the fact that $1,299 is still a lot of money, and you can get into this pursuit for a lot less money if you go down an analog route with a slightly less spec'd drone, if you just want to find out whether or not this is for you. So it's a fair wad of cash. Added to that, the batteries cost $159 each, and you're definitely going to want at least 3 of them if you're going out flying. So it's an expensive pastime, and you really need to make sure that it's for you if you're going to get involved in this system. In terms of my thoughts on all of the above, I would really like to go down the DIY route, get myself a nice drone that would give me some of those ridgeline shots with a GoPro that I can take through real steady and get those kind of amazing 90-second shots flying through the Alps. That would be what I would want to do, because at face value that's probably not possible with the DJI FPV, in part because of the stabilization system in here. But I'm never ever going to get to that point, and that's the reality of the situation. Certainly in terms of assembling the drone, that's a challenge in itself, but then you have to learn to fly the thing with a level of skill that is absolutely beyond me. So for me, the only way of getting into FPV is through DJI's system, and I think that'll be the same for a lot of people. As for whether you should or not, well, it's quite a lot of money, and you need to weigh up if you have that amount of money burning a hole in your pocket, and if you're going to get value from this. How accessible are flight locations for you? For me, it's very hard to fly a drone at the moment, so I have to drive a long way to get this up in the air, and the idea of taking all of this and sticking it to my head, and then I really should have a spotter and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of barriers to using this. Added to that, I don't get much pleasure out of seeing the footage that I generate because the picture quality is not so great, and I come at it from a filmmaking perspective. It's entirely down to you as an individual. I've just given you some facts and opinions. I would love to hear what you think of all of that. But I'll come back to my original point, which is it is the most fun I've ever had with a drone. No question. But it's so much fun that it does turn me into a bit of an idiot every time I get it in the air. So I think I've said enough on all of that. Do let me know what you think in the comments below. I enjoy the chat and the discussion, and we will see you next time.